Get my 6. Have you ever wondered where the legend or the myth or the facts behind Bigfoot Sasquatch originated? Most folks, when asked that question, would answer that it was simple: the 1967 Patterson film. But a quick Google search will show you that the legend begins even further back than that. History.com, from where I gathered this information, states that in 1958 it was journalist Andrew Genzoli of the Humboldt Times who created this myth of Bigfoot Sasquatch, frankly by relaying a local logger's story. Turns out that in the woods of Northern California, some loggers had allegedly found some very large tracks that looked like that of a man. They were simply too big to belong to a normal-sized man. Loggers would often blame acts of vandalism on Bigfoot, according to the article on History.com, which claims to be, or to tell the origination of the Bigfoot Sasquatch story, we'll call it. Bigfoot Sasquatch would then make its way, or her way, or his way, or their way, certainly there would be more than one, we would think, into popular culture. TV shows would have guest appearances of the occasional Bigfoot Sasquatch. There would be shows, for instance, a TV show called Truth or Consequences, which offered $1,000 to anyone who could prove the existence of Bigfoot Sasquatch. Once Bigfoot went public, the characters started showing up everywhere. What if the actual first documentation of Bigfoot Sasquatch in post-colonial America actually dates back to the mid-1850s, and not in California, nor in the Pacific Northwest, but in the southwestern region of the great state of Virginia, not far from the banks of the New River, nor the James, in a community known as Farmville, home to one of the oldest educational institutions in the United States, Longwood College. What if this documentation of this Bigfoot Sasquatch from the 1850s started out simply as entries in the journal of a man who was training to become a pedagogue at Longwood, which at the time was a female seminary college. For those of you who don't know what that means, it was a college not so much which sought to educate women or to make the playing field level for women, any sort of suffrage purposes, but female seminary schools were basically institutions where women of good standing from higher class families, socioeconomic wise at least, were taught proper etiquette, how to behave in public around others of their social class, how to properly host dinner parties and whatnot when among others of their class. Sounds like a crazy story, but I'm going to tell it to you. And I have documentation from the journal and from a secret journal which was kept in the ledgers, or the medium, the blank space around the pages of an old book of mathematics from the 1850s, cleverly hidden among other books on a bookshelf, hidden in plain sight, but found in the 1960s by a woman who contacted me about this time last year and invited me to her beautiful, vast estate in Southwest Virginia to inspect the journal and to inspect the book of maths, to give my take on it. Why? Well, as I would find out after I'd done this, it was for very self-serving purposes on this woman's part, but frankly, I can't say that I blame her. What you've got to understand about this woman and her family, and we'll call her Sarah, is that they are one of Virginia's first families. They can trace their roots back to the settlement at Jamestown, and their land was actually granted to them by King William in pre-colonial times. By the time these incidences occurred in the mid-1850s, which was 70 years, 80 years after we had become an independent nation, yet still a decade before the Civil War, during a time when the institution of slavery still existed in our country. This family had quite a reputation, among the elites at least. I'll get that later. The wind just picked up. I looked so professional until the wind just blew half of my notes away. Upon a special request, with some very special circumstances involved in this request, I did travel down to this location late last spring, not quite summer. We were getting close. My wife and our son were in the Philippines at the time. I had some time on my hands and I wanted to do some follow-up with some research I've been doing. So I went down and I met with Sarah, and I met her husband, Ubu, and I did inspect the journal, and I inspected the book of mathematics, and I want to share some notes with you. The embarrassment for Sarah's family was caused by a great uncle named Stanley, who, having recently completed his education, was in an apprenticeship position at this female seminary school, Longwood. And he was training to replace a professor that was about to retire when a series of odd events occurred. These events, which were recorded in Uncle Stanley's journal in the beginning, would later be recorded in the math book, and these events would lead to repeated institution of Stanley and eventually his death, if you can decipher for yourself whether or not these events were related. But you'll understand Sarah's self-serving purpose in inviting me and allowing me to inspect these books once I've completed reading to you my notes. Once I gained access to the journal and the math book, I began with the journal, and I began reading through several entries that were commonplace, oftentimes what he had had during a particular meal that day or who he had spoken to. But the first entry of significance that jumped out at me was this. This was from Uncle Stanley's personal diary. In the journal entry was dated 12 September 1855, way preceding both the Patterson film by 110 years and the story about loggers in Northern California by a century. 12 September 1855, the words written by Uncle Stanley. A very queer thing happened today. I'd given quite the lecture on the importance of proper dinner party hostess etiquette when afterward, and while crossing campus to leave for the day and retire back at my family's estate, I saw an odd figure just within the wood line behind the illegible building. I wrote the word illegible because I couldn't decipher which building he'd written. At first, noting its color, I assumed it was one of the slaves working the landscape. However, upon having a second thought and realizing there were no slaves on campus that I had ever seen of such brute size, nor realizing I had never seen a slave or free man alike of such size, I turned back for another glance, but as mysteriously as this figure had shown itself originally, it had now mysteriously disappeared. 1855. Could Stanley have seen a Bigfoot Sasquatch? Potentially. I continued to sift through the journal, and I found this just over a week later. 20 September 1855. An odd conversation with Professor Snyder presented itself today after lecture. While walking together out of the lecture hall, we spotted a student sitting on the portico staring into the woods. I fear that lass is not fit for us, the professor said as we passed this young damsel. She's new to high society. Her father is actually first-generation affluent. It's wonderful that he's made a fortune in Pittsburgh in textiles, but subtract his financial situation, and I fear the family is little more than country ruffians. I assured the professor that the young student in question, who I would soon find out is called Regina, would come around and exchange her innate lower-class ways of living with ours. After saying this, I turned and looked back at Regina, and I saw her, still staring blankly out into the fields. I followed her gaze with my eyes, and just as my eyes' vision captured the edge of the field where the forest begins, I again saw the very specter I believed I had seen only a week before. However, just as my eyes registered its existence, it slipped into the forest and was gone from sight. 1855. These notes are from 1855. Again, 23rd September, 1855. Professor Snyder, this is the man Uncle Stan was to replace at some point, asked me to take our distracted maiden, Regina, aside and get friendly in a professional manner with her. He informed me that he felt the young lady to be quite intelligent and full of country sense, as he coined the term, and he believed there might be enough hope, at least, in getting her started in the behaviors of we elites in order to begin passing our learned traits down to the next generation. I have to pause and say, isn't it amazing how wonderful these people thought they were way back in 1855? God bless them, huh? But alas, I continue with the journal entry. No doubt she'll secure a gainful marriage, as her father's wealth is quite immense to my understanding. I pity the girl myself. I feel I must instruct this young lass, new to true existence for all intent and purposes. In order to simply save her from embarrassments when socializing with the civilized. We, Regina and I, sat on the portico after lecture, and though I tried to speak with her cordially, she seemed distracted. She continually looked off into the distance, and each time I inquired about that which distracted her, she would apologize. I wanted to ask if she feared seeing the brute of which I'd journaled before, but alas, here I was, her pedagogue, at least pedagogue in training, and I could not afford to be viewed in the light of a lunatic, should my eyes indeed have been playing tricks on me. I fear our conversation had little to no value. October 3rd, 1855. Lecture ran late this evening, and the days grow shorter, and I fear I was followed home this evening. The weather was beautiful, and I'd chosen to walk home and take it in, but once I'd left campus, I had the feeling I was not alone. I turned several times, sometimes out of instinct, and sometimes after having heard something lurking in the forest just off of the road, but never did I see anything. The case of young Regina weighs heavily on my mind, not so much as I'm concerned of her not making it in our society, but rather because I believe she knows what I know about this brute lingering about campus. Could he be an escaped prisoner? A madman, perhaps with a certain appetite he needs filled? 2 days later, October 5, 1855. Professor Snyder called me in for a private chat today. He felt concerned as he'd overheard my discussion with young Regina earlier in the day. I simply asked the lass if she'd been noticing a strange being lurking around campus. She said she had not, but alas, I believe she was not being honest, for I saw the look of fear, nay, terror, register across her face when I asked the question. Upon pressing her to change her answer, she refused, and she quickly broke our brief engagement by claiming responsibilities elsewhere. I have reason to believe she may have gone to Professor Snyder later and reported perhaps the topic of our discussion. This only conjecture on my part. Professor Snyder gave me a dram of opium for my nerves and recommended I take the next day, tomorrow, off. There were no entries in the diary after this point. Sarah told me that her family believes soon after this point that Uncle Stanley spent 30 days in a mental institution. When he did add another entry to the journal, it was 26 November, 1855, a day or so before Thanksgiving. This is his entry. An early snow fell today. It's been recommended that I take more fresh air than usual, so I walked home after lecture. I did not speak in the hall today, but rather observed. Professor Snyder feels it will be easier on my nerves to ease back into things. By the way, Sarah also informed me that during that 30-day period where there were no journal entries, Regina vanished. The story that was floated around was that she had met a local farm boy in Southwest Virginia and had run off with him because she had felt the pressures of high society descending upon her, having come from the commoner class, such as me and most of you watching. But the truth was never known about Regina. She simply vanished. Back to the journal entry. 26 November 1855. Uncle Stan is walking home in a snow. I was nearly home when, while walking with my head down, I noticed something before me. It was a track that, by Jove, looked like that of a man. However, there was no way it could have been that of a man. The track, good heavens, was more than twice the size of my foot. There could be a man nowhere with feet so large. Just as the extreme enormity of the track registered in my mind, I detected movement out of the corner of my eyes. I turned my head quickly, and alas, there stood my brute, only inches inside the forest, and he was glaring at me, his eyes full of hate, and his mouth was agape, and he did drool so. And as he turned to run, for some reason, it occurred to me that his body was covered with the fur of a beast. Though human in nature his face might have been, this was no human. Knowing my haunting brute had found me, I began running. I ran all the way home, and I slipped and I fell on the ice, cutting my forehead, requiring care. And I supposed when my care provider came, I was found babbling about my brute, and I was sedated. And I slept until the next day, though it was early, still daylight, when I retired. This was the last entry ever made in this journal. Sarah informed me that her family believes that her uncle was institutionalized for a longer period after this. Some in her family believe it was 90 days, some say 6 months, and some have even guessed a year. But in the 1960s, while Sarah was young, she found hidden in an old bookshelf in their old pre-antebellum Virginia mansion down there in Southwest Virginia, a hardback book about mathematics that had belonged to her uncle. In the margins, all the blank spaces throughout the book, which I inspected in the family library at the vast estate, shed new light on this situation. I now share with you what I could decipher from that book of mathematics, written perhaps by a madman, perhaps by a man who has the actual first recorded history of Bigfoot Sasquatch in post-colonial America. 15 March 1856, 6 years before the American Civil War. Yea, the Ides of March were upon me today. I journeyed to campus on foot to see Professor Snyder in order to change his mind. He has said that he will reconsider me in the fall as his apprentice, but alas, this was to be his last year before retiring. Will he even be here next fall? Is he pushing me away? I noticed another young man, quite handsome and charming, with the professor today, and he is no doubt my replacement. This sits unwell with me. So if this is March of 1856, we were able to decipher that Stanley was in the nervous hospital for about 3 months. And when he got out, obviously he figured out that if he continued to journal, he was going back to the mental hospital. So he started keeping these notes secretly in this math book. The next entry, 20 March 1856, 5 days after the entry I just read. Damn it be the stars! It has been confirmed that I am no longer being considered to replace Professor Snyder upon his retirement. I again went to the good professor today in order to assure him I am ready to return. And he turned to me and he said, "Good God, man, pull yourself together. You are out of the bidding. You are unwell." I stormed away from his office. This, on top of his refusal to tell me what happened to the young Regina, is more than I can bear. I am convinced that perhaps this has all been a ruse. Perhaps I was never wanted for the position and they have been plotting against me the entire time to make it appear as if I am of unsound mind and not fit for the position. I am leaning toward believing that even Miss Regina was a fraudster, nothing less than an actor, hired for their little ploy. This will not stand. 23 March, 3 days later, 1856. I accosted Professor Snyder outside the gate of campus today. It had to be done. I pleaded with him to come with me, simply to walk home with me. There had been heavy rains of late, and I'd found a new set of prints left by my brute just up the road. I knew that if I could only show the professor what evidence of what I'd been seeing around campus, evidence of that hideous beast which has been following me home, lurking behind bushes and trees and standing at times in plain sight in the fields. Oh, confounded beast! Why not show yourself when I have a witness? Footsteps. Professor Snyder was to be my witness this day, but alas, he called for the guards and they took me away. They allowed me to calm down in the foyer of their guard offices, and they secured my ride home in a carriage. Upon reaching my family estate, they instructed me to stay away from campus. 2 days later, 25 March, 1856. They are making plans for me. I know not exactly who they are, and I know not their plans, but I will beat them to any action. I and I alone will decide my fate. I will not end up in ruin due to the nervous condition that my lurking nemesis has caused, nor will I let lessers than among my own kind determine my fate for me. This was the final entry in the Book of Maths, which served as the secret diary of Sarah's great-great-great-great-uncle. Later that night, after that entry was made, one of the staff at the estate heard a loud thump in Uncle Stanley's room. Upon going upstairs to inspect the room, the servant found Uncle Stanley dead. He had hanged himself by a beam that ran across the center of the ceiling of his room. Did we just witness the history of the descent of a madman? Or did we get firsthand the notes, the first notes in recorded post-colonial America history in regard to the origination of Bigfoot Sasquatch? There's only one way to know, and that's to read the entire story of my visit down to Farmville, Virginia, my discussion with Sarah, especially after I'd read the journals and the conclusion that she and I came to, which you can do by reading Bigfoot Sasquatch Files Volume 13, now available on Amazon. See you for more next time. Tree knock.